Hello and welcome back to the Toolbox project. In this video, we're going to get preparing the components for glue up by pre-finishing and pre-masking the inside faces. Let's get going. Okay, so this stage is very, very important. You're patient with and you take time with. Don't glue this thing up prematurely because with the nature of this design, when it's glued together, there is no way of cleaning any glue squeeze out from the inside faces. And by the time you are able to get to it, it's going to be absolutely rock solid. So we need to ensure that these inside faces are pre-finished. So we haven't got to try and get in there and get into those corners after it's assembled. But also that finish is going to somewhat resist the glue. But just as a backup, we're also going to mask those internal faces just to make sure we don't get any surprises. So I'm currently working with oak and I'm going to sand this up to 180 grit. I don't usually see any need to sand oak higher than that, especially given the fact it's the inside face and also it's a toolbox. But the main thing to look out for here is no matter if you're doing this by hand or if you're doing it with a random orbit sander or some other sander, try to avoid hitting the baseline of these joints with the sander, especially those miters and also the bottom of the box as well. We're actually going to chamfer those corners with a plane towards the end of this video, so be careful not to pillow over the edges of those with the sander. As for the tongue and groove base, obviously the top of that is now going to be inside the box and so you're going to be sanding off all these markings. Before you do that, just transfer them all over to the back of the components because we'll still be able to sand this area and finish it after assembly. But you want to make sure that the internal markings on this are all gone, as well as any internal markings on the lid or the sides, should you have anything. Make sure all of your markings are now on the outside and they're all clear and accurate. And so this is my setup for sanding. I've got the board clamped in the end vise, nice and securely. It doesn't have to be an end vise. You could, of course, just have it on a non-slip mat or something like this. But more importantly, I've got this thing. So this is just a bit of MDF with a little slot cut out the top. I've somewhat clamped that hose in place just to keep it secure. And that prevents the sander from tipping backwards like this due to the weight of the hose. It's just lifted it up and it's nice and supported now. And I'm not going to lie, I learnt this about 10 minutes ago from an Instagram story that Sean Eveleighs just did. Sean learnt at the same college as me, he has exactly the same education as me, and he also has a YouTube channel that I feel the least I could do is promote that by putting a link in the description because this is a great tip. So I'm going to start with 80 in this case, then we'll swap over to 120 and then we'll finish up with 180. Okay, so next we're going to start looking at some of the finer details that need sanding, particularly the edges. For example, around the edges of the lid, there's a little bit of fluffiness from when I planed the chamfer on the edge. So with some sandpaper wrapped around a hard block, we'll just go up that once or twice to break off that fluffiness, because that may actually be seen after assembly because we have got a small shadow gap around the edge of this panel. So you want to make sure that's gone everywhere. Then we're also going to do these top and bottom edges of each of the four components. Whether you do this with sandpaper or a plane is up to you. I'm actually going to do it with sandpaper despite saying I was going to do it with the plane earlier. But we're just looking to put a tiny chamfer on that edge to take away the roughness and to give a nice little detail around the top and bottom of the box after assembly. And then finally, we have the tongue and groove base, in particular these edges, because when this sits out the bottom of the box, these will be protruding somewhat. It's a minor detail, of course, it's up to you if you do want to clean them, but I'm going to go around and just give the end grain a little bit of a scrub, as well as these long edges, just because I don't want to have any fluffiness or burning visible while that's poking out the underside of the box. Okay, and with the edges all in order, internal faces sanded and prepared, we can move on to finishing. So just to start this from the top, I am going to be using Osmo to pre-finish the inside faces. I always go for Osmo, that should be no surprise to you. But we're going to do one coat of Osmo, and then after that's dried after 24 hours or so, I think it dries a little bit quicker than that, but I usually give it a bit longer just in case. And then after that's dried, we're going to do a coat of wax. This is microcrystalline wax. You could use beeswax or any other wax, to be honest. But the reason I'm using wax on top of this is because wax is very, very good at resisting glue from sticking. The Osmo in itself is pretty good, but then proper wax is even better. And of course, you don't need to do one coat of wax. You could do 2, you could do 3 if you want, and you could just use a normal oil instead of something like this, which is an oil and hard wax blend. The finish and number of coats is up to you, is what I'm saying. I would just advise finishing it in a coat of wax afterwards, whatever you happen to choose. So to apply the Osmo, I'm going to be using these non-abrasive mesh pads. I'll put a link to these in the description below if there's something you're interested in, but I'm not going to dwell on this process too much because we have covered it in the dovetail box, the cabinet, as well as various other videos. All of those will be linked below. So I'm going to get started with these. We're going to do the inside face, and I'm actually going to do all the edges as well. The only one we're not going to do is that external face because we can get access to that after assembly. And of course, when doing the actual main components of the box, we're going to do all these internal faces while being careful to avoid the joints themselves and also those miters. You just want to be doing that large flat face in the center, and don't worry if it goes into the grooves or anything, that's absolutely fine. It's just these joints that you want to avoid. Okay, now I've got another clean non-abrasive pad and I'm just going to go along and buff them all off, make sure there's no excess anywhere. So we're going to let those dry overnight and then come back tomorrow and start applying the wax. Okay, we're back, day 2. So let's get this layer of wax on now. Exactly the same principle as before. Get it on and avoid the joints. But just a reminder, you could do another coat of Osmo or whatever finish you happen to choose before doing this layer of wax. Layer it up as many times as you want. Just make sure to finish with wax. And when applying wax, I prefer to leave it sitting on here for a little bit before buffing it off. About 15 minutes or so is usually quite good. It's probably worth me reiterating this as well. Although we need to avoid getting wax on the back of the dovetails, don't be afraid of getting it in the grooves for the top, the bottom, and also the tongues for the tongue and groove base and the tongues for the lid as well. The reason we're making these out of solid and we've got these gaps between them is because we want them to be able to move over time. And if they're glued in position, they're not going to be able to do that. So in fact, getting some wax in these grooves will prevent those things from getting stuck and therefore allow them to move over time. So I actually intentionally get these grooves filled with the wax as well. Right, and just like that, all the internal faces are pre-finished and are going to resist any glue squeeze out absolutely perfectly. Saying that, however, we do have an extra step to do, which involves masking off the internal faces, as well as making some extra gluing blocks and things prior to gluing this up. But all of that is going to be in the next lesson. So, as always, thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do not forget to press the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next lesson.